After the end of World War II, the world entered a new kind of conflict, a struggle not fought on traditional battlefields, but in politics, ideology, and global influence. This is the story of the Cold War, told through the key events that shaped more than 4 decades of history. Our journey begins in February 1945 at the Yalta Conference, where the leaders of the Allied powers met to decide the fate of the post-war world. Just a few months later, in July 1945, the Allied leaders met again, this time in Potsdam, Germany. But the mood had changed. With Germany defeated and the war in the Pacific still raging, new tensions emerged between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. President Truman, replacing the late Franklin Roosevelt, took a much firmer stance towards Stalin. The seeds of mistrust were now firmly planted. By early 1946, the fragile alliance of the Second World War was unraveling. Eastern Europe had fallen under Soviet influence, with Moscow installing pro-communist governments in countries liberated by the Red Army. In the West, concerns grew that Stalin's ambitions would not stop at Germany's eastern border. On March 5th, in the quiet town of Fulton, Missouri, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood before an American audience alongside President Truman. His speech was a stark warning. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. These words captured the new reality, a Europe divided between East and West, between communism and capitalism. The phrase Iron Curtain would define an entire era, and the Cold War had now found its name. By 1947, the ideological battle lines were drawn. The Soviet Union was consolidating its grip on Eastern Europe, while unrest and political instability spread through Greece and Turkey, nations at risk of falling under communist influence. On March 12, 1947, President Harry S. Truman addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress. His message was clear and historic. The United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This became known as the Truman Doctrine, the formal declaration that America would actively oppose Soviet expansion anywhere in the world. For the first time, the United States committed itself to a global strategy of containment, marking a decisive turn in the Cold War. It was no longer just words and warnings. It was a promise backed by action, and it set the tone for decades of confrontation ahead. Just 3 months after the Truman Doctrine was announced, the United States unveiled another bold move, not with weapons, but with dollars. On June 5, 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall stood at Harvard University and proposed a massive program of economic aid to rebuild war-torn Europe.
Europe is still emerging from the devastation and dislocation of the most destructive war in history. Within its own resources, Europe cannot achieve, within a reasonable time, economic stability.
This was the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program. Its purpose was twofold: to revive shattered economies and to prevent the spread of communism by promoting stability and prosperity in the West. Over the next 4 years, billions of dollars in food, machinery, and resources poured into Western Europe. Moscow denounced the plan as an imperialist plot, forbidding Eastern Bloc countries from participating. The economic divide now matched the political one, and the split between East and West grew deeper. The Cold War was no longer just a political standoff. It had become a battle for the future of Europe's soul. In 1948, the Cold War took a dramatic turn. Berlin, the former Nazi capital, was now divided into sectors controlled by the Allies, deep inside Soviet-occupied East Germany. When the Western powers introduced a new currency in their zones, Moscow responded with a bold and dangerous move: a complete blockade of West Berlin. On June 24, 1948, all rail, road, and canal routes into the city were cut off. Food, fuel, and supplies for more than 2 million people were suddenly trapped behind Soviet lines. The West faced a choice: abandon the city or find another way to keep it alive. The answer came from the sky. American and British aircraft began a relentless operation known as the Berlin Airlift, flying in everything from coal to candy for the children. At its peak, planes landed in West Berlin every few minutes, around the clock. For nearly a year, the airlift defied the blockade until, In May 1949, the Soviets backed down. The crisis proved that neither side would easily yield, and Berlin became the very heart of Cold War tension. The Berlin blockade left no doubt. Europe was divided, and the threat from the Soviet Union was real. In response, the Western nations took a historic step toward collective security. On April 4, 1949, representatives from 12 countries, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and others, gathered in Washington, D.C. to sign the North Atlantic Treaty.
The treaty shall enter into force between the states which have ratified it as soon as the ratifications of the majority of the signatories, including the ratifications of Belgium, Canada, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
Its core principle was simple yet revolutionary. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This alliance, known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was designed to deter Soviet aggression and ensure that the West would stand united in the face of any threat. For Moscow, it was a clear signal that the capitalist world was now organized, armed, and ready. With NATO in place, the Cold War entered a new phase. Two opposing military blocs, each convinced of the righteousness of its cause, facing one another across an increasingly fortified Europe. Since 1945, the United States held the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb, a symbol of military dominance and a pillar of its early Cold War power. That changed on August 29, 1949, at the remote Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic device, known in the West as Joe-1 and in the USSR as RDS-1. The test sent shockwaves through the world's capitals. The nuclear age was no longer an American advantage. It was now a two-sided standoff. From this moment forward, both superpowers had the means to destroy each other, and the Cold War entered its most dangerous dimension. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, launching a full-scale invasion of South Korea. Backed by the Soviet Union and later supported by Communist China, the North sought to unite the peninsula under a single communist regime. The United States, acting under the flag of the United Nations, responded within days, sending troops, ships, and aircraft to halt the advance. What followed was 3 years of brutal fighting, from icy mountain passes to war-torn cities, with the front line shifting again and again. By the time an uneasy armistice was signed in July 1953, millions were dead, the borders had barely changed, and Korea remained divided, a lasting scar of the Cold War. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died, ending nearly 3 decades of absolute rule in the Soviet Union. His death shook the communist world and briefly raised hopes of easing Cold War tensions. Power shifted to a collective leadership, and the Kremlin adopted a more cautious tone toward the West. But the rivalry between the superpowers continued. Only the players at the top had changed. On May 14, 1955, in Warsaw, the Soviet Union and 7 Eastern Bloc nations, including Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, signed the Warsaw Pact. It was Moscow's direct response to West Germany joining NATO earlier that year. The treaty established a military alliance under Soviet command, officially binding the Eastern Bloc into one armed force. While presented as a pact of mutual defense, in reality, it cemented Soviet dominance over its allies and gave Moscow the legal framework to station troops across Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact stood as the Eastern counterbalance to NATO, solidifying the world's division into 2 hostile camps. On May 1, 1960, a high-altitude American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down deep inside Soviet territory. The United States had used these flights to secretly photograph Soviet military sites, believing the planes flew too high to be reached by enemy weapons. But the Soviets brought the aircraft down near Sverdlovsk, capturing Powers alive and recovering much of the wreckage. Washington at first denied the mission, only to be exposed by Moscow with undeniable proof. The U-2 incident was a diplomatic disaster. A planned peace summit between President Eisenhower and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev collapsed, and hopes of easing Cold War tensions vanished overnight. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. American reconnaissance planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around the island, demanding the missiles be removed. For 13 tense days, the superpowers stood on the brink, as Washington and Moscow exchanged ultimatums and prepared for the worst. Finally, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, and the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully, but it left an indelible lesson. In the nuclear age, even a single miscalculation could mean the end of humanity. On December 8, 1991, in a quiet forest residence near Brest, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords. The agreement declared that the Soviet Union, once a global superpower, no longer existed, and in its place arose the Commonwealth of Independent States. 2 weeks later, on December 25th, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War had ended not with a final battle, but with the collapse of the Soviet state itself, a moment that reshaped the world order and left the United States the sole superpower.